Another group of CrossFit athletes are going to Madison for the games this summer. Thanks for joining us for our daily semifinal recap show. I'm your host, Lauren Kalil. We are joined again with Jake Marconi, Brian Friend. An exciting day, especially on the men and women's field. What did you guys think of the Granite Games overall? Jake, we'll first start with you.
Oh, man, I thought it was a pretty exciting day. Brian might disagree with me, but I thought there was some cool storylines happening, and I think we saw some pretty impressive performances.
No, I definitely do agree. Jake struggles with my sarcasm at times. The drama was really high, and I can't really remember a time where I was almost nervous for the athletes in both the men's and women's field as I was during the final tonight.
Well, we'll get to that shortly, but first, let's start with the teams. The top 5 teams going to the CrossFit Games, they asserted their dominance early in the weekend. We have CrossFit Invictus at the top of the leaderboard, followed by CrossFit OBA, CrossFit Move Fast Lift Heavy, CrossFit Greater Heights Ascend, and Rhapsody CrossFit. Any surprises for either of you guys going into the final day? Any standouts from these teams in the final 2 events? Brian, we'll start with you.
Surprises, I would say the biggest surprise here is probably Rhapsody CrossFit. The other 4 teams are fairly well established in terms of, having, maybe there's some new teams there, but they have a lot of team experience. And I thought those would be the top 4 teams coming in, and clearly they were. But Rhapsody CrossFit had to fend off several other teams throughout the weekend. And the thing about them is last year they competed at the Atlas Games online. And so no one really got to see them at this stage of the season. They didn't have a great CrossFit game. So they're a little bit of an unknown. Also, their captain from last year, Jared Shaw, competed on their team last year. He was coaching them this year, so they had a little bit of a different makeup. But once they got into the 5 spot, as you can see there, fairly consistent, and it just was able to hold off the teams in 6 through 8 that just kept changing places with each other, but no one can make a push to knock them out. So I would say really well done for CrossFit Rhapsody in terms of surprises this weekend.
Looking at CrossFit Invictus, they've been at the top of the leaderboard all weekend long. Jake, how do you think that they will fare once they get into the mix with some of the other teams like Mayhem, Reykjavik, and some of the other groups that we've been talking about heading into the other weeks of semifinals?
I think they're certainly in that same conversation with those teams. Like I said, they're individually all very good, and they all have gotten, I follow them all on Instagram, they've gotten very strong in the last year, and they clearly work together as a team, right? They got posed with the challenge of working on the worm this weekend and having to do some synchronized movements, and they did really well in those events. So I don't think going into the games, there's any reason that they're not going to be in that fight for the top.
Let's now move on to the women's field. Jake, I'm going to start with you because at the top of the leaderboard, Mal O'Brien, you've been watching her train. You've been over with Matt all weekend, cheering her on, seeing her. Last year, she was second at Granite Games. This year, she was like, that wasn't good enough. I'm going to get first. What was that like?
It was a cool full circle moment. So first time I saw Mal was here at Granite Games last year. So to be on her team this year and be on the sidelines watching her win those events and win the event overall was a super cool experience, and one that I really haven't had before. I haven't been that close to somebody who was in the race or running for the top. And this year we trained together every day for the last 3 or 4 months. The last 6 months we've been training partners. When we both moved to Vermont, we spent every single day, all day together, and to see her work pay off was really cool.
Yeah, and we spoke with Matt Frazier a little bit ago, and he said that there were even moments where he had to tell Mal to throttle back, make make sure you break up the chest to bar, you don't need to beat the other athletes by more than a minute in these heats. Were there any times in training where a similar situation happened?
Oh yeah, all the time. We would be doing something and Matt would say, "Hey, hold this pace," and Mal would go, "But I can go faster." And Matt would explain that that wasn't the point of that, or the intention was different. So all the time pulling the reins back on Mal.
I think he just didn't want Jake to feel too bad or lose by too much too often.
That's not true, because if that were true, training would go very differently. And she is smoking me in training, so
It's a fun dynamic to watch, I'm sure.
Yeah,
Taking a look at the leaderboard again. We have Amanda Barnhart in second, Danny Spiegel in third, and Alex, her maiden name, Gazan.
Kazan.
Thank you. I wish that they would change that on the game site. And Emily Rolfe. What an intense last heat with the rope climb
Super
and
cool.
the run. There was so much going on. You really didn't know what was going to happen, especially for Alex and Emily and even Chloe. They were sitting on the edges of their seats nearly, just waiting to see what was going to happen. Brian, so many shifts in this leaderboard. What was it like seeing these athletes play out the way it did?
Yeah, I mean, if you weren't following along, like at the start of the day, it was Chloe 4, Alex 5, Emily 6. After the fourth event, Chloe was still fourth. Emily moved to 5. Alex fell to 6th. And then going into the final, obviously, we see that Alex jumped all the way up to 4th. Emily retained 5, and Chloe dropped to 6th. But the way that happened was extremely dramatic. And it's, for Alex Kazan, that was a workout, that legless rope climb workout, that she knew she could do well on. And it's kind of similarly to what Jake was talking about. Her coaches were even throttling her back in the last 2 rounds because they saw that she was ahead and they knew that she didn't need to overdo it and risk missing one. So she kind of won that workout going away. And at that point, it was all but a certainty that she would make the games. When Emily Rolfe then finished ahead of Chloe Wilson, it was going to be really close because there were actually times from previous heats that ended up factoring in. Chloe actually got beat out by a woman from another heat by 1/10 of a second. That cost her 4 points. Those 4 points would have put her still 1 point short of Emily. But that's why on the back end for us, like it was almost as tight as it could be. And I thought we were going to have a MAC repeat with 1 point keeping someone out of the games. But very impressive for Alex. Huge accomplishment to make her rookie games. Equally as impressive for Emily Rolfe. I mean, it's getting harder and harder as a veteran in the sport with all these young men and women coming up. So I know she's super happy about that. But I just want to say, it was a really impressive weekend from Chloe Wilson. And I know she didn't make the games here. She did not have an event finish worse than 7th this weekend and still didn't get in. And that's what we're talking about in terms of the quality of the field. And I just hope that she can, hold her head high still and know she had a great performance. I'm sure she's hurting because she was 2 spots out last year. She was 1 spot out in 2018, and she's 1 spot out again. She's a hell of an athlete, but it's hard. It's a hard sport, and it's tough to make it, and the fields are just getting harder and harder every year.
Do you think that the Granite Games or the MAC were a deeper field for the women?
Probably, I think that as far as North America, I think the Granite Games might be up there. I mean, I'm just looking at the women, like I said, like Chloe is just knocking at the door right there. Fikowski, in my opinion, is a games caliber athlete. Just really outside of the strength event, she was just as good as anyone. But it's just that this field is really good, and everyone who needed to answer the questions did. I know a lot of people were doubting Danny Spiegel. Amanda Barnhart did not get a lot of coverage this week because she was just so consistent but never winning. And they were, they're both veterans and they just held their own. Emily Rolfe still has it, obviously, and that just left 1 spot for a rookie. And Alex just was a little bit better than Chloe this week. So I think it was a deep field, one of the deeper ones in terms of North American women for sure.
What do you guys think it's going to take for some of these other women to be able to break through and take one of those game tickets next year or maybe even in the couple years from now?
Sounds like a good question for Jake.
Yeah, the truth is I think that the field is growing to be so deep that there are every year is going to be spots that are 6, 7, 8. Those people are games quality athletes just as much as the top 5 that just didn't make it. I think that you have to be really strong at everything. Like Brian said, she didn't have a finish outside of the top 7 and still didn't make it. That is unheard of in the past, right? The conversation going into events was always, hey, if you can manage to finish not outside of the top 10, have a couple of top 3s or maybe a top 5 in there, you're going to make it, right? And that's not the case anymore. So I think that the athletes can only control how much they get better in the next year, and right, some of that's out of their control and they can keep plugging away. And I think we're going to continue to see fields where we're saying just what we're saying today, where 6, 7, 8 are games caliber athletes.
And speaking of the high caliber of athletes, same could be said for the men's field. going back and forth on this leaderboard. Ultimately, Brent Fikowski, he ended up standing at the top. The professor, followed by Phil Toon, finally punching his ticket to the games. Travis Mayer will return for his 8th CrossFit Games. Samuel Quant, and then Colton Mertens after, I think, his worst finish in that last event, but was able to squeeze in. Man, again, having the rope climb running event as the final workout of the day, how did that build anticipation as people were waiting to figure out who actually was going to go to the CrossFit Games, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially on the men's side, there were a lot of relevant times from the earlier heats. I had talked to some athletes at the beginning of the weekend that said, some guys who might be out of the fight may be demoralized after some of these long workouts and not be as relevant as they could have been coming into that final. That was the total opposite of the case. I mean, several as the heat 2 and 3 or 1 and 2 were going, I was like, man, these times are not that bad. Just if you're looking at the relative times here compared to other semifinals, I think the running on the turf and the jumping off the turf and the last workout of the weekend will make just the average time slower than places where it's earlier in the week and it's on rubber flooring. But I knew it was going to be tight. And so for some of these guys, like a Colton Mertens or a Tim Paulson, who was already not that sure about this event, I think, this is about as tense of a moment as you get, lining up for something where execution is already so critical and knowing that the margins for error time-wise are just as small.
Jake, were you surprised by anybody who did not qualify on the men's field?
No, I was surprised by some of the folks who were in that top 10.
Who in particular?
Matt DeLugos was really impressive this weekend. He's had a really consistent rise, and he's gotten better year over year. I've known him for a couple, and I was impressed. And then watching him just burn down that last event was impressive.
Brian, when you look at the top 10, were you surprised, especially somebody like Tim Paulson, who's been to the games before? Did you think that, moving into the final day that he was going to punch his ticket, or did this pan out the way you anticipated?
When we talked about this field coming in, I had, obviously Chandler Smith I had in the top 5, and this was just a tough weekend for him for some other reasons. But outside of that, everyone in that top 9 was someone that I thought had a chance to make the games. Sam Quant's a great example. I really was struggling to get any information on him from anyone. And obviously last year he had a really tough semifinal, so I didn't know what to expect, good or bad, this year. And I think he was intentionally kind of playing it close to the vest. But what we saw today was that I think Sam Quant is back. He got a 3rd place and a 3rd place in a really tough field on the last day here in 2 very different events. And, it's exciting because the men's field at the games is going to be one of those fields where there's a lot of guys who can factor into the equation points wise on a variety of events. And Sam is certainly one of those guys if he's at the shape that we saw him this weekend. So I'm really happy for him that he's able to overcome that problems he had last year physically and have a performance like this. And it's kind of crazy that like Colton could take one guy had withdrawn or 2 guys had withdrawn. He was second to last in the last event. He took 10 points and it was still enough. And we talked about it yesterday that like he was in 1st coming into this day. And I thought he might fall all the way down to 4th. It ended up being 5th, and it was only 10 points that he had to flirt with. Otherwise, like going from 1st to outside the games line in one day is crazy. But that's what we're looking at here. These guys are really good. They all have a diverse set of skill sets. And it's also, I think, just a tip of the hat to the programming to allow for, such a variable amount of workouts and expressions of physical capacity by the men here.
Were either of you able to catch up with Colton? I mean, looking at his face at the end of the workout, and even when he finally heard his name be called, you didn't see the like celebration or the sigh of relief. It almost looked like he still like didn't believe that he was going to the games.
Jake was down on the field. I was up in the booth. I don't know if you got a chance to see him, Jake.
I didn't get to talk to Colton after the event. I saw him in the warm-up area and had said hello. And I went up and he had that athlete look on his face where he was like, hey man, he didn't say this, but his face was like, I need to focus right now. And so he was getting geared up to go into that event.
I can tell you this, Lauren, because I did talk to him this weekend, and there were some things in particular that he's been working on throughout the year that he was very pleased with how they went. And in particular, those are the wall ball workout, 150 wall balls. Obviously, he's the smallest guy in the field out there. He was very happy with the execution. And not only that, but just how his body felt in the back 2 sets, the 40 and 50 in that workout, made him feel like the work had paid off this year in that specific discipline. And same thing with the running and the biking this morning. Like, he knew that he's at a disadvantage, like just biologically in a workout like that. But the time that he'd put in the last 12 months allowed him to express his potential better than he has been in the past. And he needed all of those points as a buffer going into the final. So I would imagine that it's a tremendous amount of relief, but also hopefully some pride in the work that he's put in, just on his own on the farm out there to make this possible.
When we look at how deep the fields were for both the men and women's side, Jake, how do you think that these 10 athletes will transition once we actually make it to Madison and have that type of programming, which I guess is still unknown because of a different programmer this year?
So I think that this semifinal is probably the most indicative of the game style of programming, in the sense that the time domains were so varied, right? In all of the other semifinals, we saw one longer event. Here we had two. We had a mid-range event that was sprinty, right? You can have an 8-minute event that's kind of slow and an 8-minute event that's very fast. And we had both of those. And the regionals workout was really fast, right? But that's not a sprint workout in the sense that it's testing how well you can endure pain. But the handstand walk thruster one is. So we got to see a lot of different energy systems tested, a lot of different scenarios where athletes can react one way or the other. And there was a lot of transition. There was a lot of different things there was a lot of balls in the air, and you had to keep them all in the air. And so I think that these athletes were tested in a way that is probably most similar to what you'll see at the games. So I do think that these placings will translate to the games, and that you'll see these athletes perform pretty well on that style of workout.
I'll just jump in here too, Lauren. The one thing that I really like about these 10 athletes in particular is that I think every one of them has a combination or a skill sets that allows for them to have top 3 to 10 finishes on a few different workouts at the games. And even though obviously only so many athletes can finish top 10 by the end of the games, I want athletes at the games that are finishing the back half that still have the potential to show up and influence the points at the top half in certain workouts. And I think all 10 of these athletes have that potential at Madison this summer, which means it just puts more pressure on the people that are contending for the podium to not have those bad finishes. So I'm really happy with this slate of athletes as part of the bigger games field.
I know we're recapping Granite Games, but the Far East also ended. Roman Krenikov is going to the CrossFit Games. I hear that, things are going to work out and he's going to get back to Madison. Do either of you think that he has potential to stand at the top of the podium at the CrossFit Games?
I don't know him well enough as an athlete to make that claim, but I think he will be one of those athletes that Brian is talking about that will be stealing top 5 finishes. Not stealing because he's fit enough, but he will be getting top 5 finishes. Yeah, earning them.
I think he's there's a good argument to be made for the potential to be a top 5 finisher at the games. I think it's a little bit of a reach to say that he could win the games this year.
Okay. A conversation for another time. Maybe we'll get into it a little closer to the games. What were each of your highlights from the weekend at the Granite Games? Jake, we'll start with you.
I mean, it's got to be Mel winning. She's my training partner.
Well, I'll just add into that conversation. Like, it's one thing to win, and there's then a different thing about winning a certain way. And when I'm looking at people who I think have the potential to factor into the podium equation at the games, and I'm at semifinals, I have a kind of a benchmark of 550 points or more that puts you in that category for me. And she's at 580, which is only 20 points short of perfect on the weekend. And it's 4 event wins. That's the kind of performance that you want to see from someone. And then we have obviously the insight of knowing that, Matt and Jake are holding her back even a little bit there. And when you see something like the transition from what happened to her on an Echo bike last year to what she did to the field on the Echo bike this year, and obviously not everything's tested at semifinals, it just makes you wonder what else has she improved on this year that we'll get to see at the games. So, what we saw from Mel this weekend is a real threat for the podium a month or so from now.
Insight from Brian Friend. Was that your highlight moment?
No, I think that it certainly is a highlight, but I think that I'm gonna just give Brent a little bit of credit here. He's taken the whole offseason off, and we talked about it yesterday. I think he's really on a trajectory to give it another run at the games. Just knowing him and how he operates, like this weekend is a kind of a small dichotomy of that, where he started off outside the cut line after day one. He was in third after day two. And he just let everyone else make those mistakes as he continued to get better and ends up on top of the podium at the end of the weekend. And I think that in that same conversation with Roman, like Brent is a top 5 guy at the games if he's healthy. And if he's really healthy and dialed in, then I think that he is one of the few guys that can challenge Justin for the top spot.
Interesting. Brian Friend, Jake Marconi, this has been so much fun. Thanks for keeping us up to date every day at the Granite Games. Are you guys going to go celebrate now with anybody?
Absolutely. I'm going to go have some pizza.
Yeah. What kind of pizza?
I have no idea. I didn't order
it. Any pizza is good, right?
Any pizza.
Brian, are you going to celebrate or just go to bed?
Oh, no. We got stuff to do tonight. We've worked really hard. We got to go have some fun.
100%.
All right, guys. Thanks again. You have fun. And we have one more weekend of semifinals and then almost to Madison. Last Chance Qualifier. And then here we go.